Welcome to Tax Defense Connect by DPZ with your host, Delphine Parigi. In each episode, we will discuss keeping and defending your empire against tax fraud accusations. Please note that the contents, opinions, discussions, and any other related information from this podcast is not intended to be tax or legal advice. Individuals and representatives of entities should consult with a tax professional based on the specific facts and circumstances of the taxpayer to determine how federal, state, and foreign tax laws as applicable may apply to their specific situation. You can find the show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Now here's the host of Tax Defense Connect by DPZ, Delphine Parigi.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to have this conversation with brilliant French criminal defense lawyers, Elena Fedorova, who is specialized in crime defense, asset tracing and recovery and sanction. Before I'm letting the voice to Elena, I want to tell you that the question of sanctions, geopolitical sanction, to me is very linked to tax fraud because it has impacts in tax, and the scope of this specific topic is really linked. So to me, we are in criminal tax defense, and we are going to speak for the next 30 minutes with Elena Fedorova about geopolitical sanctions. How are you, Elena?
Very good, thank you. Thanks for having me here with you and to discuss this very hot topic.
Yes, definitely hot. And also very unknown topic. I think the purpose of this podcast today is really to clarify all the gray areas regarding the wrong beliefs regarding this topic. I think where maybe only few leaders can feel involved, only few lawyers feel involved, and I think the scope and the impact is so much broader. So today we are particularly focused on the EU sanctions in today's geopolitical and economical landscape, especially for tax professionals. So about how many sanction regimes exist in the EU, Elena?
So you're right, Delphine, to tell us about the fact that for you, the sanctions are in intersection with tax obligations, and there are many topics in intersection between sanctions and tax obligations. But you're also right, I agree with you, to take this step back and to talk first on the sanctions background, what is that? And so you're right to ask this first question as well, because it looks like for general public, it can look like there are only 2 or 3 sanctions regimes in the European Union, but that is not true. And currently the European Union has 33 sanctions regimes in place.
Oh, 33.
33.
I saw there were 2, like, okay, 33.
That's a lot. Absolutely, that's a lot. And they are targeting over 85 nationals. And it should be noted that for Ukraine, there are 2 sanctions regimes in place, and Iran contains 3 sanctions regimes. So sanctions regimes are counted not according to countries, but a different legal framework. And one country may contain different sanctions regimes.
If I may interrupt you to really clarify the understanding of the listeners, do you mean that today the 33 sanction regime do not focus exclusively on Russian nationals, or do they focus exclusively on Russian citizens?
No, not at all. And there are many regimes targeting different third countries. And 3 of these 33 regimes are targeting Russia. I'm sorry, 2 of them. 3 of them are targeting Iran, Syria, Venezuela, and so on. So there are many regimes in place. And that is true that regimes have expanded and even exploded over time. And currently, there are over 5,700 persons targeted by all of these European sanctions regimes. And most of them are individuals. Most of them are not entities, are not governmental organizations. Most of them are individuals.
Okay. Maybe to step back as well, because obviously there is a huge need of clarifying and defining. What do you call exactly as geopolitical sanctions?
Okay, so right question, because there is a confusion in general public's mind. So European sanctions are a tool under the common foreign policy of the European Union, which aim to uphold international law, prevent international crises, support conflict resolution, and so on. And notwithstanding its common name as sanctions, sanctions are actually not punitive measures at all. What we commonly call sanctions are in fact restrictive measures. The difference is very important here, and the difference is that these restrictive measures are provisional and temporary measures. So they are not final, they are not punitive. And those measures aimed to achieve a particular goal of common foreign and security policy of the European Union. So these measures are intended to bring about a change in what is considered by the European Union as bad or harmful behavior of any third non-European country. So it should be noted that the European Union implements all of the sanctions adopted by the United Nations Security Council, but the European Union also adopts autonomous sanctions regimes. That is why there are over 33 regimes in place currently.
So what does it mean in practice to be a sanctioned person? Imagine I'm from Venezuela and I am a sanctioned person by the EU. So it means it's by the 15 states of the EU. What happens if I have an asset in France or in Italy? What is in practice the impact?
So the European Union sanctions means that you are targeted, you are a designated person in all of the member states. And most sanctions adopted by the European Union are targeted at individuals, and some of them at entities as well, or governmental bodies. And European sanctions in practice consist in asset freezes and travel bans and the prohibition to make funds and economic resources available to listed entities, individuals, to listed persons. So the freezing of funds and economic resources in practice includes assets owned or controlled by targeted individuals or entities, which those assets may not be accessed, may not be moved, may not be sold. This notion, this definition of the assets controlled by targeted individuals is subject to interpretation by national competent authorities, by the European Union itself, by the European Union Commission. So one should be very careful when it comes to the definition of an asset or an entity or a person to be owned or controlled by the designated person. Travel ban means that it is impossible for a designated individual to travel to the member states of the European Union. Per se, this is a very problematic issue when it comes to dual individuals, so dual nationals between a third country citizenship, a third country which is targeted by a particular sanctions regime, and member state individuals. Those dual nationals are in fact allowed to travel to their country of citizenship of the member state of the European Union. But with a difference with all other European nationals, they cannot travel beyond the borders of the member state of which they have the citizenship. So it creates discriminatory situations where the citizens of the member state of the European Union cannot travel on the same basis as others.
I think it can be, for me, for the travel ban, I'm not sure right now to see specific link between these sanctions and tax. But what is very important for me and for any person involved in criminal tax questions is the impact of the impossibility to have assets controlled or owned by these individuals. I think there is a huge topic for us of, for instance, if you have an individual owning French real estate in France with the owner for many years, how should he pay French real estate wealth tax or not? And it resonates for me, and of course we have some practice on this topic, is there is a lack of liquidity from a pure economical standpoint, because for a temporary period, this person is banned to sell, to transfer, to enjoy the assets. And at least in France, I think this type of consequence is new to the authorities, that they have not anticipated that banning individuals with these restrictions, which is an independent decision, is actually reducing the potential taxes at the level of the states. And that's by banning this individual, it creates a situation where they ban themselves from tax if they want to apply these principles, and if they don't want to apply any discrimination. So it's very, very... Do you see any other topic with respect to, before we go maybe to exception of the principles, but I think the asset frozen is clearly a place where tax lawyers should be integrated. Are there any other sanction that you can see has difficulties with?
Well, I think I need to remind you of the travel ban impact on tax obligations as well, because you were talking about asset freeze and its implications, interactions with tax obligations, and that is absolutely true. But also the travel ban has its impact as well on the tax obligations, because now we will be talking about this inhabitants tax, right? Which is due, at least in France, by the residents in France, and the fact that the targeted person cannot travel to France may have an impact on this tax obligation as well. There is no exception, no direct exception in tax code, as far as I know, to implement this situation actually, but this is definitely something one should bear in mind for its tax obligations through all of the member states of the European Union, I think.
Yes, and I think which is very interesting as well is like when they introduce these sanctions, not only the one with Russia, the country had, I think, an automatic implementation of stopping the implementation of the double tax treaties. Today, there are no treaties between France and Russia, for instance, and I guess it's the same with Venezuela and other countries. But this is really clear. So the impact is in fact that the taxpayers cannot benefit from the double tax treaty and has to pay tax in two countries. But it's very interesting to see that they have not, at least France, has not considered the consequences about a more widely spectrum. And I believe if we look at really the principles of taxation in France, indeed, for instance, from French real estate wealth tax, the person has no access to the property, so the value is much below, maybe to nil, because it's like the absence of ownership, very, very, very simply. I think thank you very much for this clarification on the type of sanctions. Are there any exceptions from this assets freeze and travel ban? Because my understanding, it's like it's not so simple. It's not that everything is banned. There are lots of exceptions. Is it correct?
This is correct that it's not only everything is frozen and you can do nothing with those funds. The European regulations implementing sanctions provide for derogations from asset freezes and from travel bans. Those derogations are very limited, and to be able to access to such a derogation, you need to apply to a national competent authority to get a sort of license to use frozen funds for specific purposes, such as paying taxes, for example. So this is provided by regulations. And for travel ban as well, derogations, but they are very narrow. Like you need to travel for humanitarian purposes. So that's or to participate in an intergovernmental conference or something like that. So this is very, very narrow. As far as derogations from asset freezes are concerned, there are numerous, but still they are very limitative.
Yes.
Sure.
I just want to come back on this topic about the impact with tax. To me, it's a very silent subject. I have to tell you, I think with only few lawyers, I had this opportunity to speak about and to think about the impact of. I'm speaking about French real estate wealth tax. So maybe for the listeners, French real estate wealth tax is a tax which applies to individuals regarding the fair market value of the real estate owned directly or indirectly in France with the value of 1.3 million euros. And each year, as 1st January, we need to determine this value.
Yeah.
And it needs to be the fair market value. And of course, in principle, it has to be a declarative obligation every year in May, where you declare your assets, the value of the assets, nature of the ownership. And then the question is, which value? So imagine I am the owner of a band, have a sanction. I have an asset of 5 million euros in France. It was my holiday property. What and how should I declare? Because as you said, either we say, okay, it's a full ownership, we declare 5 million, and then we need to pay. But to pay the tax, we need to have a specific declaration to be able to pay this tax, with very complicated issue with the banks by definition. And it's a question of, if we apply the interpretation of the French real estate wealth tax, the ownership is not full. So should we declare 5 million? Should we declare half of it? What is the real value? And this is where some lawyers, tax lawyers, we can question this value and discuss with the tax authorities of how we can challenge. And maybe, I think it's a decision which can be challenged with the courts, but as it's very linked to political position.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure that a taxpayer declaring zero would obtain zero from the tax authorities.
And it is important to notice here that, well, as I told at the beginning, sanctions are not sanctions. They are restrictive measures, so they are provisional and they are temporary measures. But in fact, we can see that they are constantly expanding and they are constantly extended, so that we never know how temporary they are. So this situation could be extended to many, many years, depriving, in fact, the individual from the use of his or her assets. Absolutely. And here I should also remind you about this invention of the Russia sanctions regime, which did not exist before in the European Union, which is a reporting obligation. The reporting obligation means that in the 6 weeks period after you've been designated as a sanctioned person, you need to report your assets to national competent authorities. Why I'm talking here about that is that this kind of lists assets of sanctioned persons become, in fact, a list of assets to look through for national competent authorities, for tax authorities, to run tax audit on that, and also for investigative authorities as well, to run investigations on those assets and on individuals possessing them. So there is another intersection between tax obligations and sanctions obligations here.
Before we come maybe to practical takeaways, I would like to, when we prepared this podcast, you told me, Delphine, there are many persons who can be impacted by this sanction and they don't know. And what does it mean? What can I be impacted and I don't know? What exactly is it? Because it's employees of companies which are indirectly controlled and they are impacted on employees. Who is impacted? Because you said, okay, there are several names. So obviously, a person who listen to us, watch us, are not these persons, because it has also impact. So I would love to hear you on that.
So absolutely, I am persuaded that many persons are actually impacted by sanctions, especially professionals who have these compliance obligations, businesses, individuals. So first of all, because of the fact that there are now many sanctions related obligations, such as reporting obligation, such as compliance obligations, such as obligations to freeze assets of controlled entities controlled by sanctioned persons, and so on. So for sure, in the current sanctions landscape, it is very important for businesses to regularly update compliance programs to reflect new sanctions and tax reporting rules. It is very important for businesses.
Sorry to interrupt you, because I think it's a very important point. what is the impact if, as you say, a professional or a business doesn't check or doesn't comply with this filing obligation?
Good point. The European Union adopted a directive which requires all of the member states to criminalize sanctions violations. And sanctions violations offenses are numerous. They are all sanctioned by criminal penalties. Now it is very important not only with regard to compliance obligations, but also with regard to potential criminal violations as well. So this is why it is now crucial and for businesses and for professionals to update their compliance programs, to train their staff on red flags, both related to tax violations and to sanctions violations. And actually for targeted individuals as well, it is very important if they happen to be targeted by the European Union sanctions, to take an advice from a sanctions practitioner and from a tax advisor in the member states where this targeted individual can have assets, without waiting for any potential questions to come from national competent authorities, and to be sure that they are compliant with all of the rules applicable to them with regard to sanctions.
Because based on your practice, I understand that, I guess, that banks are very aware of that. But I guess in corporates, my practice, what I can see from supporting corporates is like the compliance is not always understood. And I guess there is a huge work, and that's why we are doing also this podcast together, of raising awareness about when you're a business, you need to have this compliance, even if you're not a financial institution. Am I right? Is it a focus we should have?
Absolutely. Once again, because of this very wide definition of what it means for an asset to be owned or controlled by a sanctioned person, it is very important for businesses, for professionals to be aware of any potential sanctions evasion schemes. And our listeners should be also aware of the fact that many national investigators of the European Union's member states already started investigations to look into, well, schemes that they consider to be sanctions evasion schemes, and they turn to become tax evasion investigations as well, which is the case, for example, of the Spanish chemical exports to Russia investigation, which is the case of some German investigations on sanctions evasion, which became tax evasion investigations and money laundering investigations. So national authorities, definitely national investigators, definitely link one to another. They look into targeted, designated individuals, designated entities, to see whether they are compliant, in particular with AML rules, with tax obligations, with sanctioned obligations.
Thank you so much. I think we had really in-depth and also very practical impact. Thank you, Elena. I think for takeaways for our listeners, if you're a business, I think it's very important, based on Elena's advice, to regularly update your compliance program to reflect the new sanction and tax reporting rules. And it's not only for banks. It is very important to train your staff on red flags for sanction and tax evasion and fraud. Otherwise, it's criminal penalty. For targeting individuals, It would be more to maybe take advice from experts, sanction experts and tax advisor in the member states where you have activities of assets. And I think a big red flag and takeaways for tax professional. I think it's really important that we are all involved on advising clients on this intersection of sanction and tax law, and on fighting the risk of non-compliance and the importance of strong and also possibility maybe to reduce the tax burden for some clients. But this is only an accessory. The most of it is really to seek for this intersection. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Delphine.
You've been tuning into Delphine Parigi's podcast, Tax Defense Connect by DPZ. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.